Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. In the early morning of June 28, 2009, about 100 soldiers from the Central American nation of Honduras forced their way into the bedroom of Honduran President Manuel Zelaya, kidnapped him while he was still in his pajamas, and forced him into exile in another country. This military coup, backed by conservative business leaders, overthrew a freely elected president. Latin American nations unanimously denounced this military coup against democracy. U.S. politicians and news media have distorted the realities, so the American people do not understand what really happened or why. This crisis continues now, more than a year later. During the next hour, we will get beyond the simplistic explanations and share information that you will not have seen from other sources. I'm happy to welcome two guests, Nina Murano and Bruce Wilkinson, who are well-informed and who've learned even more about Honduras from having spent time there firsthand. Welcome, good to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nina Murano went to Honduras in 1989 with a women's delegation and again in August 2010 with Witness for Peace. She has extensive first-hand knowledge of many Latin American countries, and she's active in the Fellowship of Reconciliation and other peace groups. Bruce Wilkinson was in Honduras in late January 2010 when the new president was being inaugurated. He went with a delegation from Rights Action, an international group that focuses on Central America. He works in Olympia with the Latin America Solidarity Organization. So it's good to have you both here. I want to make sure that people watching know where Honduras is, because sometimes people get confused about which Central American nation is which. We have a map over here that shows the southern tip of Florida here, Cuba, northern coast of South America, and the heavy line shows the boundary of Honduras, which is in the middle of Central America. Let me pull that aside and you can see the boundaries here. It's got the Caribbean actually north of it and has borders with Guatemala and Nicaragua and El Salvador and the Pacific coast out here. So it has a lot of neighbors. Nina, can you give us a little bit of background about the history of Honduras from like colonial times or ancient times to?
Well, I don't know how far back I can go, but Honduras has indigenous groups, as all Central American, Latin American countries do, as we do, Mexico. And so until the Spanish invaded, they actually lived quite peacefully. And then the Spanish invaded, and they got rid of the Spanish, I think, they're just celebrating that now. But anyway, September 15th is the big date. And Honduras became sort of the poster child for the United States, the prototype of banana republic. Its main export was bananas. It pretty well was in line with whatever America wanted, America got. And then along came all the troubles in Guatemala and Salvador, and Honduras had many people fleeing from Salvador, fleeing the oppression in Salvador, and crossed the river, the Lempa River, and there were several terrible, terrible massacres. And then there were a group of Salvadorans that did get into Honduras, and but we were behind the Honduran policy of not allowing the Salvadorans in.
Yeah, we meaning the United States government,
The United States government.
not you and Bruce.
Well, we're all part of it.
Yeah, they did it in our names and with our tax dollars.
And anyway, this was in the 80s mostly, when all the troubles were happening. And I was in Central America with the, well, actually through Mexico too, with a convoy convoy of women to Central America with 22 vehicles, buses, trucks, and 69 women. And we took aid to all these women groups through Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras. We couldn't get into Salvador at the time. It was still bad. and ended up in Nicaragua. And so we were in Honduras and met with Honduran women at that time. They actually rescued us from the Honduran soldiers that were with us in our vehicles with their M16s. And they whisked us away, and so we had a full day in Honduras, in Tegucigalpa, the capital, with, the Honduran activists, female activists. And I met two people there that I later met on this trip. One was a doctor, Juan Almendares. And I don't know whether you met, did you meet him?
Yeah.
Yeah. A very, very vocal, very, very learned man. And anyway, so that's my history in Honduras. And the fact that I mentioned that it was, we were driving, I drove a little bus, a 19-person bus through, and saw some kids along the road that had orange hair. And I thought, oh dear, the Americans have been here, and I thought that, but it turned out that a nurse on the trip said, no, they have orange hair because they have a lack of protein in their diet.
Yeah.
And evidently, you lose something in your hair and it turns orange when you lack total protein. And they had. So that was my introduction to Honduras. That and roadways that we would be driving along and suddenly the road would disappear and you would be on the roadbed. So I immediately understood the poverty, just, like that. So.
And the United States had used Honduras as a launching pad during the Reagan years here, for Reagan's war against the government
the
of
Sandinistas, the
Nicaragua
Contras.
that had progressive...
And Contras were in that part of the country because we crossed the Nicaraguan border and we saw Americans actually with Contras in that.
The Contras were the terrorists that Reagan was funding with our tax dollars, and the CIA had
Guardia,
organized
the old Somoza's Guardia.
Yeah, the old dictator's activities that we were still doing.
Yeah.
Well, Honduras had a difficult struggle and finally emerged with a democracy, and they had this election in 2005 that was free and fair election, and they elected a guy named Manuel Zelaya to be president. And although he came from a wealthy family, he somehow got his bearings and did some progressive things. Tell us what he did for his country when he was president from 2005 till 2009.
Well, Zelaya was part of the two-party system that they have in Honduras, and both parties are controlled by the elites. This is like a country where the elites control both parties, and they switch back and forth. And Zelaya was just going to be one more president like that. He's part of the Liberal Party, which is like the slightly more progressive party, I guess. You could call it progressive at all, which it isn't. And he was just known. He was kind of like he seemed kind of like had that persona of like that George Bush sort of had. He wore a big cap on his head, his cowboy cap. Yeah. He had the whole cowboy persona. He was a rancher, and he comes from that whole area of Honduras where the ranching was really big. So we thought it was going to be all the same thing, and at first it seemed like it was, but then he started changing things, and some of it kind of seemed to come out of like necessity. Like one of the things that he did, which was kind of shocking, was he joined ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Alliance for Our Americas. And that's a trading group along with Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, and a few Caribbean nations, and also
so it's
Ecuador.
An alternative
Ecuador.
to it's an alternative to the U.S.-dominated quote free trade stuff that actually benefits the U.S. corporation.
Yes, exactly. And this is a lot of this. It made a lot of economic sense at the time, actually, in a certain way. This freed up more through with the help of like Venezuela. The Honduras was able to get cheaper oil through Venezuela's programs, Petrocaribe, which is another group, and when they were able to do that, they were able to buy oil on like 20-year loans at like 1% interest. It was a sort of solidarity giving that was like really helpful for them, and that freed up money for them to like invest in their public schools. They were also able to help with other things, like another program that was put into place was they were given like cattle, and were able to raise a calf for each family, and once you birth the calf, you pass the cow on to the next family, who then was able to raise another calf. It was an interesting program. So they had lots of interesting programs like that going along. And right before, around January of 2009, he increased minimum wage by 60%. And that was just a big affront to the powers that be, so to speak. You know, they would not put up with that. But you know, Zelaya, who at the time was working under this whole, he was becoming part of like this whole group of Latin American voices that were saying, you know, things have changed. You know, we're not going to accept this sort of situation anymore, where like the U.S. dominates our economy and tells us what to do, and instead, you know, they were like, you know, we need to develop as a society. We need to educate our people. We need to raise the standard of living for all people, and we need to decrease the massive amount of poverty. And there was an incredible amount of poverty in Honduras, and there still is.
Tell us about the coup then that happened in 2009, end of June of 2009. There were some issues floating around about trying to update the Constitution and stuff, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But tell us about the coup, and then we'll get into the background behind it. What actually happened on June 28 and those next few days?
Well, they came in, and they took him out of in his pajamas, and took him up to a base called Palmarola, where there are 500 American soldiers for a drug interdiction. Honduras is quite the drug route through Central America, particularly in the northern part of the country. And they flew him out. And he almost got back in a little bit later, and then he did get back in. And then he was in the Brazilian embassy, and they did all sorts of things. They had music outside the Brazilian embassy.
And this would be the Honduran, the coup government of Honduras.
The coup government
was harassing the
Brazilian. And just doing all sorts of things. And then there was a whole thing that we set up with Costa Rica, that he was going to talk to Michelete, who was the guy who had planned the coup. And anyway, and that didn't go anyplace. Though Zelaya was very amenable, but Michelete said he was, but then he wasn't. And they were just stalling for time until the elections, when Zelaya would have stepped down, because under Honduran law, you can only serve one term.
Right.
And so they complained that they said, well, they had to get rid of him because he wanted to be president for life, and which was not true. And he simply wanted to have a constituent assembly. This was only to have people come together and talk about changing the Constitution, which had not been changed. And it was so much a military thing that the military actually deliver the vote boxes in Honduras, and they pick up the vote.
Yeah.
I mean, so they have a lot of power. And they were just voting, the people were voting, and it was the day that they took him out that was the day of the vote.
Right.
You know.
So the vote that you're talking about right here is a vote about whether it would be a good idea to have
just to have a constituent, not
so
to change it, just to meet.
And the news media accounts that I kept hearing and seeing from the U.S. confused that stuff. They repeated this. He wants to be president for life.
He wanted to change the Constitution.
Claim, which is not true. And the Constitution had been there since 1982, and it was grossly out of date. And there had been quite a number of amendments, reforms, fixes, and more needed to be done. And so he was looking at whether the public would support the idea of creating
Right.
Right.
People were very excited about it. They were very
what
excited.
we would call in this country constitutional convention, and they called a different name.
Yeah, there was. I mean, it was a pretty straightforward vote that was going to happen. It was more like a poll. They were
it was
polling.
public opinion polling
Yeah.
more than we think of as like an election
Yes.
vote.
Right.
It was a non-binding referendum on whether or not in the November, and this is June, whether or not the people thought that in November there should be another vote as to whether or not to have a constitutional assembly. And that would be a time. And then if the people voted for that and then voted in November that to have a constitutional assembly, then they'd have to have elections again for people to be part of the constitutional assembly. And so this was like a long process that takes a lot of years of change. Yeah. But you know, the Constitution of Honduras was made in 1982, and it came out of, that was right when Honduras stopped being a military dictatorship and came into quote-unquote democracy. And the Honduran military didn't immediately give away its power at that time. You know, it was a long process over several decades. Yeah. And it was really kind of like when Zelaya took power was a lot different than when Zelaya was starting off. It was finally at the point where like the military was no longer running all the different affairs of the country. They had finally given over political power to a government.
And this was also because of economics. You understand, there's a free trade section in Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, the second largest city. And these are the maquilas.
Okay, it's like what the United States has along the Mexican border.
Exactly, and that's where Gap, and just a whole list. I mean, if you look in your tags, you know, a lot of your clothes are going to have been made by very young women, 12, 13, 14, because there's no age thing, in San Pedro Sula.
Okay. Well, that's where Kathy, you know, in the 90s, the Kathy Lee Gifford scandal.
Oh, yes.
That was about Honduras. She had child labor in Honduras making her line of designer clothing.
Okay. So when the coup happened, and it's a military coup, and so they kidnapped him, they hauled him out of the country, the Congress picked the head of Congress, Micheletti, to be the interim president. And how did the rest of Latin America respond to this?
Well, they thought they had gotten rid of that happening in Latin America. It was the first coup in, I don't know, since the 90s.
Yeah, it
you
was
know, a long time.
Yeah, there had been real progress toward democracy.
There had been real progress. There were, Guatemala always had a little, you know, well, maybe, you know, but there had not been a coup for quite a long time, since the 80s, actually. And then suddenly, woo! And so the OAS,
the Organization of American States,
which is not just Central America, but also Latin America, and also Canada and the United States are in the Organization of American States. And they voted to expel Honduras. Honduras was out because they had done this illegal action. And you want me to go on about that?
Well, tell us a bit more. It was just like a worldwide condemnation.
Absolutely.
The United Nations General Assembly passed overwhelmingly by acclamation. They passed the thing saying, this is illegitimate, we don't accept that, that's not acceptable, we want democracy back.
Right. And also our government, that President Obama was horrified and said he was horrified, but that only lasted for a couple days. And there were other forces. The Hondurans, the elite had hired a lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. several weeks before the actual coup. And they had hired this lobbying firm to put forward Honduras as being in deep trouble with this president, et cetera, to set up the thing. They have a lot of money, and they're very shrewd. And they know America. They travel a lot here. And, you know, it's It's the 10, how many families did you say?
Oh, about 10 or a dozen
Yeah.
families,
Yeah, the-
controlling families.
And they
from the
intermarry, and then the businessmen come in, and they
Yeah.
make a lot of money, and
And
you know.
but let's not hit around the bush on this. You know, the U.S. knew that this was happening and allowed it to happen. People call this Obama's first coup since he's been in power. You know, and then maybe that's a little unfair because there's the people that were in the positions of power in Latin America and as far as U.S. appointed positions were all people that were selected under Bush, and they were holdovers. But nonetheless, this happened, and you know, a coup doesn't happen in the Western Hemisphere without the U.S. knowing about it. It won't happen. And if the U.S. wanted to reverse this coup, at any point in time, the U.S. could have done it, and that still remains true to today. You know, if the U.S. had really condemned the coup, then the U.S. could have immediately stopped it and reversed it and put Zelaya back in power. It would have taken one call, and the political will was, you know, from all over the world was there. But so the only thing that was lacking was the U.S. political will, and the U.S. political will was totally lacking.
And they did have to cut military aid, because that's part of, you know, the law, that if there's a coup, the military. However, since the quote-unquote elections, in which 30% voted, they have restored that military aid.
And that was an election that occurred in
November.
November of
Last
2009, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And that was sort of the fig leaf of legitimacy over this coup. So how did the U.S. press, the mainstream U.S. press, how did they report these goings-on at the time of the coup and since?
Well, that this man was very radical, Zelaya, because he had doings with Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who was the demon of the American press, or the Latin American demon of the American press. And he was unduly influenced by him, which was really not necessarily, wasn't true. However, they did have an arrangement with Alba and Petrocaribe for the oil, and the people were very excited about that. And they were very excited to join the mainstream of Latin America and of Central America, and to, you know, feel that they were being brought in to things finally. And but this was reported by the press as, you know, I mean, Chavez has become sort of the Castro of Central America, of Latin America.
So if you get along with Chavez, then you get it's guilt by association kind of thing. 'Cause they made this demon.
Right. Except actually, everybody's getting along with Chavez now, except maybe Peru. But everybody else is getting along with Chavez because he's very reasonable about the oil, and he's got a lot of imagination, and he has set up banking things and he's essentially trying to just set up things that just involve Latin America that are not controlled by the United States.
Right, and that's an affront to the powers that be in this country.
That is the big problem.
The stuff that I saw in the press was making just gross distortions about the notion of the Constitution of Honduras, the Constituent Assembly, or the allegation about President for Life. All these things that are not true, but the mainstream press in this country just seem to report kind of like the coup government's talking points.
Oh yeah.
And not the accurate stuff. And it was just so frustrating, because I'd have to look at the peace movement press or the alternative press
to find
what
was really going on.
Well, you know, Lonnie Davis was hired by PR firms that from Honduras, and he was like a campaign advisor of Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, friend of the Clintons, and you know they did a great job with PR spin. Now, you know, they went really far on like discrediting Zelaya in the media. You know, but it's hard to dislike the guy. You know, it's hard to find something really wrong with him. You know, people the couple days after the coup happened, they rolled out a resignation letter from Zelaya, in the press, and the press just ate it up. Went around the
Claiming that he had signed
Yeah,
a letter
he never
resigning.
signed it.
right, saying that he
Never
was
signed it.
mentally ill or something like that, and then the whole thing came up as being like completely made up, completely fabricated in the Honduran Congress under Micheletti, to completely backed up this resignation letter, and then was turned out to be
Bogus.
bogus.
Yeah.
Then they had to back off of it.
And
But
when-
the damage was done in the media.
Right.
Right. And they fired 5 judges who objected to what was going on. And then the Supreme Court rubber stamped the coup,
Yeah.
and then there was a prosecuting attorney, and something like the state's attorney or something like that, and they got rid of him too. So
It's a little bit like, for those who remember the Watergate thing, the Saturday Night Massacre, where
Yeah,
Nixon
oh,
and his
yeah.
people were firing all the people who were opposing
Yeah.
his corruption.
Yeah.
After the coup, they installed Roberto Micheletti to be the interim president until the November 2009 elections. And what did he do? Can you summarize what he was doing between there and
well, he was holding down the fort.
Yeah.
But and I told you that he actually made his nephew the mayor of San Pedro Sula, which was the second largest city in Honduras. I mean, and he was the general who actually was the one who grabbed Zelaya and put him on the plane. And he became the head of communications in the government.
right?
So he got all and the control is pretty thorough from the top.
Yeah. Well, they've been closing down TV stations and
Right.
killing journalists
Right.
and a bunch of stuff. They've been
The
trying to
second
prevent the
largest
truth.
amount of journalists in the world.
Micheletti, it was a dictator.
Yes.
I mean, we installed a dictator. He wasn't directly in control of the military, but the military had the coup, and then Micheletti was put to run the government by the military, and he rolled back almost every progressive piece of legislation that Zelaya had passed. He went quickly to cut he cut back, made laws against women's rights, made laws against gays, and
Cooperatives, land
cooperatives. Yeah, he cut back on land deals.
He also stole.
Dropped out of Alba.
Yeah, and he also stole some money from a health
Oh,
system
right.
and
They
used
had
it for
a
something
dengue.
else.
They have a big problem now with dengue, which is
Dengue
the
fever
dengue
yeah.
fever. When I was there, it was just enormous, and then it came out that Micheletti had actually raided the health ministry, and they didn't have the money they thought they would have to fight dengue with, and so that was sort of a scandal. But it didn't come out in the regular newspaper. It came out in the progressive newspaper, which is not as clandestine as one would guess, because I managed to find a copy at the airport.
Huh.
So they're not quite as thorough as they would
Yeah,
like to be.
yeah.
But they have clandestine radio stations all over the country.
Yeah. So the people themselves with low power, localized radio.
It's like 40 kilometers or something like that. We went down and visited one, and they had been off the air. They had 300 policemen come in and actually circle their radio station, which
Yeah.
was like, 8 by 12 or something, concrete building that they had built. And, and put a tape around it saying this is a crime scene. And they removed the tape and put it up in the station. It's very attractive. But
But they were doing, there was just a massive amount of repression of human rights, and people were getting
Off.
beat up and killed, and they were doing this as a way of, it's like what the death squads were doing in El Salvador a couple
Right.
days before,
But
where they kill somebody and then they make sure that you see the body at a prominent
Oh, yeah.
location. And that's a warning to the rest of you, don't you dare disagree with our new coup government.
We're running things.
Yeah.
But remember also that we didn't mention how small Honduras is. Honduras is, well, they say 7 million now. And of course, and most of the population, as with most of the third world countries, is under 18. And so you have a whole youth movement there that doesn't know from the 80s or the 90s.
That's right.
You know? So this youth group has been galvanized. The young man that was running the radio station we went to was 19.
Wow.
You know?
Yeah, so that population of their country is roughly the same size as the state of Washington population.
Right. And that's really interesting for comparisons of like, it's great that the European Union and the United Nations and all the countries in Latin America, minus the United States, condemn the coup like outright, completely, no strings attached. But the really most important thing is that the people of the country have shown an amazing amount of dislike for this coup. That was another thing that was in the media coverage in the United States, which is that people in Honduras wanted Zelaya gone.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
that was
They
another
wanted
big
it.
lie.
They wanted the military to throw them out. They wanted the military to like put in a curfew that was from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. After that, you're not allowed to leave your house for several weeks. They want it. That's what the newspaper would tell the people in the United States. When exactly the opposite, hundreds of thousands of people were taken to the streets. There was huge worker strikes. Massive amounts of workers went on strike, and all this wasn't really reported with the sort of like emphasis in the United States media, if it was covered at all. It was covered as like, this is the minority group, these are the outcasts, these are like a small group, agitators. I mean, when I was down there, and this is 8 months after the coup, there was a march that was 200,000 people strong. And that's a big march. And remember, this is the population the size of Washington.
Yeah, so you imagine having a march,
In
a
Olympia.
protest march of 200,000 people just from this state alone.
I mean, the WTO protests in Seattle, which everybody glorifies in this state or to some degree, that was like 50,000 people.
Yeah, so 4 times that.
Four
size.
times that size in Seattle. I mean, that's a big protest march, and this is they had for over 140 days they had daily protests against.
That's right.
And this is in the face of huge amounts of police repression.
Remember too that the American embassy, when this comes up, is that, for instance, the 9 journalists that have been killed. Well, that's discounted because we don't know how many of them were political, and there's gang activity. There's a lot of gang activity. There's a lot of crime. So they put all these human rights things they put into the crime basket.
Right.
You see, and that's the way. And it's always been like that in Honduras. And then you come up with, well, what about the teachers' strike? Because their pension funds, 40% of their pension funds disappeared, and the teachers went on strike.
Yeah.
And these people are incredibly corrupt. They are raiding the government.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, well, that it's always been like that. That's the way it is in Honduras. That's the way it is.
Yeah. So people who want to find out what's really going on have to get beyond those
The way
kinds
it
of,
is.
Yeah, well, beyond the U.S. reporting that distorts things in that way and find alternative sources.
Right.
So in November of 2009, there was an election that had been scheduled, and that was to produce a new president and so forth. And the guy that got elected is Porfirio Lobo, who's known as Pepe Lobo, and that election seemed to fool the United States government
and a lot of other governments
media,
also,
and some other governments, and the mainstream
the EU now
media
recognizes
into
Honduras.
thinking, oh, now they have democracy again, that's okay. But it was a crooked election, it was a sham election, and both of you told me on the phone when we were preparing for the show about the Carter Center refused to send observers because they knew it was corrupt.
No international observers whatsoever,
Yeah.
except the ones that the elite asked to come
Right.
There were a right wing from Sweden.
The right
That's
wing.
not easy to find either.
Yeah. The right wing that wanted to rubber stamp a right wing election outcome, but as far as neutral,
There were no
credible
neutral
observers, they all knew it was a sham, and they
right.
stayed away.
Well,
And
it was boycotted.
But it
Yeah,
was
the people
reported.
boycotted.
But it was reported in the United States and also by Lobos himself. That same day, he went and said, "Oh, we've won by 60%."
Yeah.
Well, 60% of what? Then it turned out that when you actually looked at the figures, 30% of the people voted, or 40%. And so then you figure, well, 60% of 40%, that gives us 24%.
Yeah.
I mean, and so it's just totally, but the United States government likes the fact that there's been an election.
Yeah, and so now everybody wants to put this behind us. And
Oh, yeah.
Obama says, "Oh, we have to turn the page and go beyond." And Hillary Clinton was down there twisting arms and
In the
bullying
OAS,
people.
She went to the last meeting, the most recent meeting of the OAS, and she told them that they had to let Honduras back in, that they'd had an election, and that everything was fine, and et cetera, and the OAS refused.
Mm-hmm. The OAS has refused, and the OAS doesn't take being pushed around as easily anymore.
Yeah.
And neither do most of the Latin American nations. And why should they? They have their own 2 feet. They can stand on their own. Yeah. And they're tired of being the banana republic for the United States.
Yeah.
And remember, there's always been a tradition in Central America. Certainly there was when I was there a lot in the 80s and early 90s, of what they called the grapevine. Mm-hmm. And things would happen. There'd be a massacre in El Salvador, and people would know about it in Guatemala, and it had never been on the news.
Yeah.
And so this whole idea of having their own what they call a red, what do you call it, sort of connections, is they have that all set up, and they've had that in Honduras for years anyway.
Now, tell us about the resistance. There's also an organized resistance.
Oh, wow.
And the best known part is the Frente, the front, I guess.
Yeah.
And that seems to have a lot of different parts of the resistance, and it's been nonviolent.
And it's democratic.
And democratic, yes.
It's very interesting.
Tell us about the Frente.
Well, they have smaller groups that feed in to larger groups, and they have the teachers, the workers, the indigenous people, and they've organized also by areas in the country, and so with these clandestine radios and things like that, and they're constantly pushing back, and it's very impressive. They have groups there like Copate, which was actually set up in the 80s, which we had visited when I was there in '89, and the same woman who was there, and I said, "You were here," but anyway, and that's for the disappeared, because they had people disappear in the 80s. They set up death squads in Honduras, and the Hondurans feel that the death squads were set up by the ambassador to Honduras from the United States, who is John Negroponte.
And he's still around.
Oh, he's going to be teaching at Yale in the fall.
Yeah. Yeah, he's just this notorious human rights abuser who shows up in many of these horrible things, and yet he's never treated as a war criminal or a pariah.
And then they have this man on television, Billy La Jolla, I think his name is. Very attractive man, and he was part of the death squads in the 80s. Notorious in all of Central America. Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I think the Frente is a movement, and and I think that I never really knew what a movement was until I came across the Frente. Because in the United States, lately it's kind of been a couch term to some degree. It's like anytime you have a coalition or sometimes even like an issue, you call it a movement. I'm working on the, anti-war movement, but it's not so much a movement as much. The Honduras has a movement. It's every different actor has decided to come together. They were there before. They may have grown a lot. But they were there before, but they all started working together. And they had some very simple issues. They decided, it's over 50 different groups, and they coordinate together, and they're like, okay, we need to decide on the lowest common denominator, Well, what do we want? We want a new constitutional assembly to be had, and we want to have a Zelaya put back into power. That was the original thing, to have Zelaya return to power. And that, of course, didn't happen. But now they are demanding that he is allowed to return to the country because he was thrown out of the country during the inauguration of Lobo. And this is like, these are people who are very committed to their cause, and there's millions of them.
And they're diverse. Then, like you said, it has different elements within it, but they can come together about what they have in common and move that ahead.
Right. I told you about the grandmother that we met outside the mall, and we were looking at a map of Tegucigalpa trying to find places, and she just offered this, went into the spontaneous thing about the government. This is the most corrupt government, all this in Spanish, and this is the most corrupt government we've ever had. These people do not care about the poor. They are taking everything they can out of the country. They are totally indifferent to any of us except their own little, areas.
And there was like a ceremony I went to where they had for the Frente, when Zelaya was forced to leave the country on the day of the inauguration of Lobo. Zelaya flew out of the airport and Lobo was being inaugurated in a stadium. There's 200,000 people who marched to the airport to see his plane fly off. He was, they took his presidential sash, which is something that they put on the president. And that day, the day of Pepe Lobo's inauguration, they took the sash and they gave it to two people. One was the grandmother of the revolution, which is this lady who's been to every single protest, been active on the streets every day, and also this little kid who's like 6 years old, who gets up on the stage and just gives off fiery rhetoric, talking about how this was a coup, and we need to get rid of the dictatorship, and we need to fight for fight.
So in mid-September they came up with the petition drive, reached its fruition.
This is a recent development.
Yeah, so this was
I had not even heard about it when I was there, actually, but they've had this, they have so much going on so many different fronts. That's why this name, called it the front, is really nice, because it has all different fronts. And so they have this petition drive to
have a constitutional assembly. It's like a...
Right. And the one that they were denied.
Yeah.
Right? And so they have over, there was one report, there were 900,000. Well, then they had 1.25 million. 1.25 million people had signed this petition. They had gone out, you understand, this is all clandestine.
Yeah.
They had gone out and collected all these signatures. And now they are presenting this petition to the OAS and to the UN. And inside the country, they're taking it right to, hey, we have this petition. What are you going to do about it? And, of course, I gather it's not being reported in the newspapers there. And
or here.
Or here.
Right.
But that's
imagine 11 million people, and that includes children, okay? And that they can get 1.25 million signatures like that. With half the population being under 15, this is just extraordinary.
And in the face of the repression from the violent government that's trying to suppress democracy.
Right.
And make money.
And
you have to understand, there's a big appeal to, there are many franchises in Honduras. They have McDonald's, they have Burger King, they have, I don't know if they Kentucky Fried Chicken, I didn't see that one. And these guys, there are Hondurans running this who are making money. And what I heard is that there are 25,000 military, or maybe that's police. There are 10,000 police, something like that. There are 60,000 security guards in Honduras. They advertised in Colombia for paramilitary to protect the wealthy families. And so There are just lots. And I asked in the embassy, I asked about that, and they said, oh, they hadn't heard about that. Well, guess who
Yeah.
guards the embassy?
Yeah.
A security firm.
Right. Yeah,
You know?
one of you told me that people have been hearing Colombian accents
Yeah.
down
Yeah, that's what they,
from
that they,
those folks.
yeah, and they can,
Yeah.
I couldn't tell a Colombian accent from, probably, maybe I could tell a Mexican accent, not a Colombian. But, yeah.
It's just a funny thing, it's like in the U.S. media talking about Chavez's influence in Honduras, Chavez didn't have any sort of influence in Honduras, really. I mean, he was helping them to, help the poor out of the country. But Colombia's influence in Honduras is just awful. They're just the worst human rights abusers in the Western Hemisphere.
Right, yeah.
And now the president
than
of Colombia
maybe
is
the
getting
United
along
States.
with Chavez, which, believe me, has Washington, D.C. plenty worried.
Ah,
Yeah.
It's going to be something to
Yep.
watch.
Yeah.
So let's look at the larger context here. Certainly the United States, as we've said, has this long history of dominating, and both militarily and economically, and certainly then politically. And Canada has mining interests
Oh, yeah.
that one or both of you told me about on the phone when we were preparing for the program.
And not just in Honduras, in all of Central America and in Colombia.
And Canada has taken sort of a rightward political tack.
Well, whatever they're right behind the United States and all of it.
Yeah.
And then I told you that I read this little item in the English Weekly out of Honduras about Carlos Slim, who is the richest man in the world, who's Mexican, and Bill Clinton traveling to Honduras to look at investment opportunities. And there's this big push to put a cruise ship complex in the northern part of Honduras on the Caribbean.
coast,
Right.
yeah.
And this is, and of course, and the indigenous people are fighting this. The indigenous people are fighting the mining because, of course, the water goes.
Right.
It's a very, I mean, they want to open it up to total exploitation.
Yeah. So, yeah. Let's see. Somebody, I forget, one or the other of you had said that this was kind of like an experiment. I think a few minutes ago you had said
no, that was Almendares.
This was.
Did you hear that from Almendares? He said
Yeah.
he said to us, and a woman did too, Berta did too, of the indigenous movement, that they said, this is an experiment. Central America is watching this to see what happens here. And so this is an experiment that other Central American countries had better watch out.
Yeah.
Because this could, right now in Nicaragua, of course, there's, the old Sandinista guy.
Yeah, Ortega.
Ortega. And then there's an FMLN ex-commander in charge or the president in Salvador, and then Guatemala, and then Costa Rica, of course. But there are mining companies in all these countries now, and so it's like, how much are they going to get away with? Guatemala is full of maquilas in Guatemala City.
Yeah, that's the low
Salvador,
the low wage work
but
zones.
they have they call it a free trade zone.
Right.
And it's set up, and it's American inspired and American. The money comes back in here, and it's like outsourcing.
Right.
And when we say that the U.S. could stop this and reverse this coup at any time, it's because Honduras is economically tied to the United States. Most of their trade goes to the United States, and also Honduras gets a lot of remittances from the United States.
Family members who are up here working and send money back home.
And
exactly. And
American business pay no taxes.
In Honduras.
Pay no taxes in Honduras.
Oh.
That the businesses pay no taxes. And so where the source of money is really from this exploitation.
Yeah.
And it's like, we'll see if this is successful still. That's sometimes you could look at this and say, like, okay, well, the coup people have won. But they haven't won. The country is totally unstable, and the fight is continuing, even whether with or without the U.S. watching.
Yeah.
You know, the fight will continue with or without the people of conscience in the United States paying attention to it.
And they're hurting economically too because of the general downturn in the world, so to speak. So Honduras is keeping on pushing. Oh, we're going to get. We know it's going to. It's going to turn around. We're going to turn it around.
But they're pushing on that the kind of economics that have shown to be failing. You know, I mean, it's that exploitation of low wage.
Depends who you talk to.
Depends. Yeah, some people are doing very well. Where could people get more information? I know there's a lot of stuff. I did a lot of background reading for this. You folks are both very well informed. You've been there firsthand. And I know there are organizations that send delegations down there so people can learn firsthand and connect with people. What else would you recommend for people to get informed?
Well, I like the website Upside Down World, which is, if you turn the world upside down, then Latin America's at the top. And so that's a wonderful source of news for all of Latin America, but they also have a list at the side of their news with all the countries. So any country you want to find out about, you just hit on that and you can get what's happening.
There's also a newly started Honduras Solidarity Network. And if people are interested in going to Honduras and seeing for themselves the empowering struggle of the social movements there, then, you know, as part of a local organization, Latin American Solidarity Organization out of Olympia here in Meaty Island, we would love to help support people to go down there. I mean,
And they're looking for accompaniers. They need accompaniers because of the human rights situation.
And accompaniers are people who go down and they stay
yeah.
with the people who are at risk because they've been outspoken as a journalist
there was
or
a
an
priest,
organizer.
Father Melo, they put a plea out for accompaniment for him in June because he was being constantly, I mean, you know, death threats, people watching you, and you know, all sorts of things. And I don't know what's happened with him. I thought somebody said he had to leave the country. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but a lot of those people will not keep a regular schedule, not travel in the same car more than once, and
but
do all
at
these.
the same time, it's not as desperate as, I was in Haiti after they overthrew Aristide with the junta. It's not that sort of desperation, you know. We saw a wonderful mural in the workers of this big workers place where they meet, and there's where this artist had, and he explained the entire mural to us. I mean, there it was, you know, this, and he's selling pieces of this, you know, mural. It's just fantastic.
Well, so part of the success about what people can do then is to actually connect and show support for people who are doing it rather than cower in fear.
Right. And the other thing is they say, well, we don't have, you know, they've taken over the media, but what they've done is their media is the graffiti. And so you drive down the street, and I kept on seeing these buildings being painted, and I thought, wow, Honduras isn't as poor as I remember. And then I realized what they were doing is they were painting over the constant graffiti.
Yeah.
Because they would paint it over, and there'd be graffiti there, and you know.
And I would check out the Alliance for Global Justice is another good website for it. Information about Honduras.
Okay.
How to help.
And we'll have some more websites listed at the end with credits. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Witness for Peace, School of the Americas Watch. A lot of these people, a lot of these thugs in the militaries were trained.
All five generals
In this
in
coup?
Honduras involved in the coup, particularly the one who took him out.
Yeah.
All five of them were trained at School of the Americas.
In Fort Benning, Georgia, with our tax dollars. So the United States Army is training thugs and human rights abusers, and we've been doing this in country after country after country, and it's not like an accident.
No.
That's part of the curriculum. In fact, I remember some years ago it was exposed that that they had, you know, training manuals about how to assassinate local leaders and and things. So it's really something. Could each of you offer a closing thought, and then we'll wrap this thing up?
Well, one of the things that strikes you when you come across these people in the frente is that they're not like we are. They're not waiting for it to be given to them. They're going to take it because it belongs to them. Now they're nonviolent, but they're not giving way, and they're losing people, and they're still there, And this one woman said to me, she said, when you go home, tell people we're still here.
Yeah.
I really liked that. You know, we're still here.
Yeah, I appreciate. One of the things I like about in Central America is people will actually stand up for themselves and stand up for democracy. Here in this country, people say, "Well, what's going to be politically feasible?" And then they scale way back from what we want and say, "Well, let's see if we can settle for something very modest that's politically feasible." And there, the people stand up for what they really want.
But remember, for many of them, they have nothing to lose.
Yeah. Well, you know, that what they have going on
Their
there
lives.
is powerful. The movement's very strong, you know, and this is self-funded. These are people. These are mothers. These are children. These are grandmothers, and they all go out there and they work their jobs. They take care of their family, and then they go and do a third job, which is they protest in the streets daily. And like it's a matter of civic duty for them. It's a matter of pride, and you know, it really counteracts all the money that the U.S. gives the right wing people and the coup mongers in
how much money
Honduras.
the coup people make.
Because you know,
steal.
I mean, when you think about it, there's no amount of money that can like stop motivated people from like committing to change.
Great. I want to thank Nina Murano and Bruce Wilkinson. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching the program. In the United States, we say that we support democracy and human rights. We say that we oppose violence, but our government actually provided political support for the violent military coup that overthrew democracy in Honduras and overthrew the democratically elected President Zelaya. And the United States government has been pressuring other countries to pretend that the phony election was a real election and that everything is okay now. This is the old policy that the United States government has been doing for decades. President Obama campaigned for change, but we're getting more of the same old stuff. The American people must absolutely insist upon democracy and human rights for everybody. Don't expect the government to do it. We have to make this happen. We want to thank Nina and Bruce. Thank the folks who've been watching. Beyond this month's topic, if you want information about other aspects of and issues for peace, social justice, and nonviolence, you can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at www.olympiafor.org. We're all one human family. We're all one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.